Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Photography Close to Home, Creatively Seeing the World Around You with Brenda Tharp. I'm Avril Christiansen from the Digital Imaging Group Committee, and I'd like to extend a warm welcome to all of you today. We have about 300 people in our audience. In addition to Digital Imaging Group members, we have many Royal Photographic Society members and also non-members from around the world. Before we start, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so you'll know how to participate in today's event. This Zoom event has a special question and answer feature at the bottom of your screen, or at the top of, if you're using a tablet, you'll see a Q&A icon. Click on this to ask a question. You can ask questions throughout Brenda's presentation as you think of them, and I'll post them to her at the end. Also, I know that Brenda's presentation is going to be so good that you will want to thank her in the chat, but please don't do this as your questions will get lost. We'll be sending out a feedback form after the event, and we'll make sure that we pass all of your messages on to Barbara. At the end of her presentation, Brenda will answer as many questions as we have time for. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce Brenda Tharp. Brenda Tharp is an acclaimed photographer, teacher, author, and speaker who leads international photography tours and workshops. Brenda loves sharing her own passion for the world around her with others and is driven to help people see creatively and open up to what is around them. She guides students to express a personal vision through their own photography. Brenda has written Expressive Nature Photography and Extraordinary Everyday Photography, and her fine art images are in private collections across the USA. As I hand over to Brenda, I just want to remind you to use the Q&A feature throughout, and I'll post your questions to Brenda at the end. Over to you now, Brenda.
Thank you so much. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen just so that you can see me on the side a little bit more. Good evening to my friends in London and Europe. You're having a cup of tea and possibly a cocktail while you watch this, and the rest of us are just waking up and having our cups of coffee or tea on other parts of the world. I want to say thank you to everyone around the world that did sign up for this. We did a lot of promotion on social media, and I'm delighted to know that there are people coming in from all over. And I truly hope that you enjoy this talk. And since Avril actually did some of my promotion for me, I can skip over some of this rather quickly. I have done several books. She mentioned Expressive Nature Photography, and the earlier books were Creative Nature and Outdoor, and I did a revision of that when asked to. And then right in the middle of that, I decided for doing something different. And that was because my partner, Jed Manwaring, and I have made a habit all of our lives of photographing everything around us, and we don't care whether it's a landscape or a bird or a leaf on the sidewalk. And we wanted to share that, and we wanted to really emphasize the idea of celebrating life that is around you and in all its forms, inanimate or otherwise. And so that's how this book idea was born. And it remains a very good seller. And I think it's because it is across the board. It's not just landscape or just birds, but it's something for everyone, if I can be so bold to say that. In lieu of doing field workshops and leading photo tours right now, I am ramping up my online image reviews and critiques, but I've added a 5-week image development program. And it's all detailed on the website. The link is at the bottom of the screen here, and it's tailored to your needs. So whether you just want a whole lot of images critiqued, which is fine, or whether you wanted to maybe sequence some for a portfolio that you were submitting or for a show that you were planning to have, virtual or otherwise, Or maybe you needed some basic technical help or some basic processing help in Lightroom. I'm here for you. So if you have an interest, head on over to the website and check that out at some point and email me, and we can begin a dialogue about what might work for you. So let's just get started. Before I jump into the everyday images, I just had to share a few images that are dear to my heart because my first love that got me started in photography was nature and the outdoors. And I just can't get enough of it. Nature heals me. Being out in it just opens me up, and I feel more alive than anywhere else when I'm in the cities and in the grocery store and whatever. That being said, that nature is a little bit off and distant from most of us these days. I know friends of mine have scooted out to the parks, and I've gone out to the coast a couple of times and made images, but it's not the same. It's not like we have that total freedom to go wherever we want to make these kinds of images. And I have a trip scheduled for next year to Namibia, and I'm really hopeful that we will have solved this dilemma that we're all facing with the pandemic so that these kinds of things can go on again, because I truly enjoy bringing people to magical places and sharing the excitement that I feel over being there and photographing. So I do landscape and nature, and I do some wildlife photography as well. And I really love all of that. But right now, I have to admit, I'm feeling a little bit grumpy like hippos. Seem to always be grumpy, but I kind of can relate to that right now because it is hard to keep up that creative juice when you're not able to do the thing that you most love to do. But I encourage you to think about that differently and open up to the idea that there is still so much that you can do right here where you live. We're all stuck. Okay, we don't like it, but we have limitations on where we can go and how much we can do and the camaraderie of doing it with friends. And I get all that. For me, I'm grateful that I happen to be interested in a lot of different things photographically, that it's the photographic process and the creative process that really gets me excited, irregardless of what the subject matter is. My goal as a photographer is to bring to light things that I find interesting. So the subject matter may be varied, and you'll see that through this presentation. Robert Bresson said, "Make visible what without you might never perhaps have been seen." And I really love that quote because it's our vision. It's your personal vision, the way you see that leaf on the car hood with frost, that is what is important to share. And it's the seeing process that's important. So not all the photographs in this presentation, I'm putting a disclaimer out right now, they're not all from my own backyard, okay? But they are from someone's backyard. And knowing that, as we did in the book, knowing in a presentation like this that we've got people watching from all over the world, it was important for me to put a mix in that represents what your backyard might involve, not your immediate yard, of course, but your neighborhood, your town, your environment. And so I wanted to include images that represented that throughout this talk. And they're not all meant to be works of art to hang on the wall, although sometimes the pictures come out reminiscent of some of the documentary photographers that made history in our past, and some of the artists as well, the painters. And so I love to look and see things in the way they saw some of that as well. But it's to get you to look beyond the iconic and beyond the obvious. And I love this quote: "Blessed are they who see beautiful things in humble places where other people see nothing. For they shall see modern art in rusting metal and peeling paint, or in curled, dried mud. They shall see beyond the literal to the suggestive, the interpretive. They will run around and point their cameras at everything and anything. and they shall make something out of nothing. And I do feel blessed that I have an overall love for photographing the light, the shapes, the moments, and the gestures of the world around me. Many photographers whose work speaks to me are kindred spirits, photographing with joy what they see, regardless of the subject. Some of them that come to mind are Freeman Patterson, Jay Mizell, DeWitt Jones, and a lot of other men and women are in that list. And they inspire me and they share my love for the art of seeing. We can make something out of nothing if we can get past the label of things, the label of what it is. So, yes, it's a piece of rusting metal, but it's also the division sign. And so, my title for this work of art is called Divided By. Sometimes it's fun to put titles to your pictures, either before or even as you're photographing or afterwards. It comes to you because it just resonates with what it says. So if we can get past the label of what it is, then we can look at this rather boring picture of glass blocks in a window, and we can see the magic that is within this area here and photograph that to become a psychedelic abstract. It's getting past the label of what is. A drain grate in the street becomes a study of nature and the will to persist in spite of mankind trying to cover it all up with a drainage grate. Photography has little to do with what you see, but it has everything to do with how you see it. So this is rather ghoulish picture, pun intended, for Halloween. And I know that Halloween, I think historically got started as a pagan ritual back in the United Kingdom, as it was England or Scotland somewhere. We go crazy for it here in the States and not so much in other parts of the world. But I think we can all relate to the rather ghoulish abstract that this represents. And these tiles looked like books stacked haphazardly when I walked by them in a shop. And it may not be art, but it's that observation, that noticing things that begins to open us up. The art of meditation is the art of noticing. And the art of noticing is really what matters in photography. You never know where your pictures are going to come from if you're just out and about, always with your camera. I took this walk with a friend, and it was in the doldrums of winter for us here in California. There's a period where there's not much happening. In fact, that's true in pretty much all the world, where winter is one of the seasons. And I just didn't expect that I was going to see much at all. So I dutifully brought my cameras and we were walking around, and suddenly, with a low angle of light, I noticed what I thought at first was steam rising off of the branches of the trees. And at closer inspection, I realized that it was the lichen and it was a sporing event. And it was just a matter of trying to capture the spores as they wafted up into the breeze, and it looks like smoke coming out of that knot. And if you went out with a plan to photograph sporing lichen, the chances are you'd have difficulty finding it and getting it in the right light, the right moment. So this was a gift from nature, and it just proves that point that if I am open and I am noticing things around me, then I'm going to be presented with gifts like this. And how exciting is that? My partner, Jed, who I wanted to get him to dip his head in briefly, but he had to run out to do errands. He is really, really good at staying loose. I get into my head a lot, admittedly, and my structure, the way I live my life, is much more structured. And Jed is a loose goose, and I love him for that, because he's getting into the car and he's tall enough that he can see the moonroof, and he sees this frost on the roof, and he says, wow, look at that. And so then he goes to work with his regular camera and he makes this beautiful work of art. And the thing that's amazing to me is how much depth there is in this picture. And yet we all know that frost is like microns of depth. And yet something to do with the light and shadow area just created such dimension in this beautiful detail that he did of my moon roof with frost. Marcel Proust said that the real voyage of discovery consists in not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes. So if I'm using new eyes, a fresh perspective all the time, I can begin to see that there is much more to this beautiful rose. I can seek to find its essence. And I do that by getting closer, by trying different lenses, by changing positions, and just thinking about how I feel about the rose. What is it about it? Well, I loved the sherbet colors in this rose, and it was just lovely. And then when I found that there was one drop of dew left on a petal, I put on my diopter and got closer, and I managed to capture that. And then I asked myself, what more is there to this rose? And now I'm really into the abstract because I have my 100 millimeter macro on and I have a diopter on to get me greater than 1:1, greater than life size. And now I'm into the petals and it is velvety smooth in texture and it's just all those yummy colors. So really just looking at something with fresh eyes and asking yourself, what more is there? What's behind the surface picture of the rose is really important. Minor White said, in terms of seeing beyond, that one should not only photograph things for what they are, but for what else they are. So here's a little series that kind of alludes to that. There was something so sensual about this composition, and I titled this one Cleavage, but I only got to this image after I spent time on my knees crawling around this potted cactus outside of a door in Tucson. The wall color against the gray green of the cactus was beautiful, and that's first what drew my eyes and drew my attention. But then I had to start really looking to see what I could do with this beautiful color contrast. And that's how I ultimately ended up back at this image. And I don't know why, but for some reason, when I look at it, I think of the Muppets and I think of Miss Piggy. She always had these sexy little dresses on with a little cleavage showing. And there you go. Sometimes it's hard to describe where the mind goes, and that's without drugs and without a lot of coffee. So there you have it. You know a little more about me now and my craziness. So again, very human, very sensual, but it's nothing more than a growth bud on a madrone tree. But it's what I saw beyond what the thing was. These robes felt so alive to me. And it's all because of that one gesture of the one robe, second in from the left, that's touching the other one. That's a human gesture. And yet there's nobody inside these robes. But I felt convinced that there were spirits in there and they were connecting. And it was just happenstance the way the robe landed when they hung it up. But I just loved that gesture because it brought this picture alive for me. This picture reminds me of beaded jewelry hanging up as if you'd see them in a shop somewhere. And it's fishing floats on the side of a building in Alaska, in Petersburg. But it goes beyond just being fishing floats if you have a little bit of imagination. And this isn't just a door handle, but rather now a heart-shaped door handle with the reflection. So just from what you've seen so far, you can find images everywhere. But let's talk a little bit more about some of the ideas. Seeing begins at home. It starts within your own home, your own flat. And I think that that is an important place to begin because it is the most familiar and also the most mundane and possibly boring place even if you've decorated beautifully and to grace the pages of Architectural Digest magazine or something, it's what you live in, it's what you see every day. So the result is you don't see it. Well, what if you start turning your camera towards the things that are in your own house, and to pay attention to the way the light comes in the windows, and while you're watering the plants, notice the light, notice the patterns, notice the texture of the leaves. Maybe you're working in the kitchen and preparing a gourmet meal, and suddenly the cheese grater becomes a rather alien spaceship-like thing. They all remind me of like little alien pods, and the blue and the silver. The blue is nothing more than daylight coming in a kitchen window that isn't sunlight, it's just the daylight of shade. So it's very blue. And against that stainless steel of the grater, it just glowed. And it was really fun to just stop for a moment, take the picture, and move on to the rest of the meal. And the same thing happened one day when I was cutting through a cabbage, and I thought, wow, that is really beautiful inside. There's a book called 10,000 Things, and it's Frederick Franck, Franck, I believe is how he spells his name. And it's a handwritten book. The text is all handwritten. So it really forces you to slow down to read the book. So there's no zooming through the book. And he's got a lot of sketches, but he talks about drawing. Actually, that may not be the title, and I apologize for that, but look up Frederick Franck. I should have had that in my notes, and I don't have that here. Um, it's about seeing beyond the head of lettuce, beyond the head of cabbage, and looking at it and drawing from it. That's the whole idea, is drawing. And so we're taking that into photography at this point. So just start noticing everything around your house. And I'll bet if you gave yourself an assignment on a Sunday morning to walk around and spend 2 hours looking at things in your home, you would find some very interesting compositions to be made. You can have a garden party for one, please, because right now we can't have a whole lot of people over unless we have a big garden and we can all keep our distance. But if you do have a garden, it's a lovely place to also then expand outside of the familiar home into a familiar garden. But the thing about a garden is that it's always fresh. There's always flowers blooming, about to bloom, flowers spent, flowers falling off. There's the litter on the ground, and there's the butterflies and the birds and the insects and everything that comes through that allows you the opportunity to make great pictures in your garden. And it might just be a patio garden of potted plants with blooms, or maybe it's just textures and patterns of potted plants. But it's a chance to get out and use your creative eyes and your skills. I loved how this Elysium was just popping up through this rusted table that had no glass on it. So it had room to grow and pop up through the wrought iron. And then I taught a backyard workshop in creative flower photography before COVID had hit, and we had a blast. And you can do the same thing in a very small space. This is a bowl that I put cut flowers in and floated them. And then I took a piece of plexiglass and I used a product called Rain-X, which is a waxy spray, and that allows the water to bead up on the surface. So when I spritzed the whole thing with a very fine atomizer and built up these beads of water, I was able to then photograph the bowl of flowers through this. So it's pushing us to be creative and come up with new ways to photograph things perhaps. But again, it's all fun and it's all good technique. And just floating the flowers in bowls, clear glass bowls, or in pitchers and so forth, and looking at flowers in a different way can be a fun way to get into garden photography. Just getting low, looking up at the sky makes this cosmos appear giant. This year, they really were giant for me. They grew unbelievably tall. and then playing with some high key photography on a cloudy day. So if you don't have a garden, maybe your neighbor has one and they would allow you into their outdoor space safely, or local parks and local botanical gardens that might be within a short distance from your home are a great place to get out and start playing. So I want to share a sequence with you here, and it's Jed's pictures done mostly with his phone. For 8 years, he walked our dog back and forth to this park near our home and then set her free to play. And on the way to and from, and even while walking through the park, he was relaxed. He was with his buddy. They were playmates to the end, and he was in a very good open space. And again, as I said, Jed is really good at that anyway. So these are just a few of the pictures that he made along the route to and from the park and within the park. And they weren't analytical pictures, they were just things that caught his eye, and it shows you the variety of things that you might see if you pay attention on something as simple as a daily task of walking the dog. And the popular quote is that the best camera is the one you have with you. And of course, our smartphones are great for that. But even just a small compact camera slung over your shoulder, it doesn't take much to lift it up, focus, and get the shot that you see when you're walking past something that interests you. And he was really good at photographing without judgment. Whereas I sometimes get into my head and say, is this going to make a good picture? You know, and the thing is, just make the picture and decide later. You can always throw it out. So we have a couple of creeks in the park, and they offer beautiful reflections as well as a great place for the dog to play and chase the water striders. There were all sorts of different juxtapositions with the reflections and the trees that grew over the creeks. And this is our beloved Mocha, who is no longer with us. But when she would come out of the creek, she would shake off. And so that was just a fun picture to also get. So you just never know, and you never stop seeing or never stop looking, and you'll see some really fun abstracts and fun patterns on the sidewalks and just the simplest of things. One day he really got into the abstract because the pollen that had burst out from all of the trees in the neighborhood was now all over the streets. And then when the rain came, it was floating on the surface and swirling around. And this picture was really cool because it just was it was the gutter of the street, essentially. But you can make something from nothing, right? And there was a bicycle that had been left neglected long enough that a vine grew through it. And then this one was really out there. It was after the water went away and the pollen was left in the gutter. And you would never know that you were looking at the gutter of a street in looking at this picture. And you might still not get what it is, or it might not speak to you, but that's okay. It just proves the point that images can be found in the most unexpected areas. So expand out from now the walk with the dog, and now you have to go to the grocery store. Well, in a lot of places in the world, that grocery store might also be a smaller market, a grocer's, where a lot of things are outside. So this happened to be a Costco parking lot, and the carts were just fascinating the way they stacked them all up, and it made for an interesting pattern and texture. But this was an outdoor shop where the market had artfully put together all of the zucchini with the blossoms on it. And it was just there for the making, that I didn't even have to do much except to compose it the way I thought it made it interesting. I was coming home from the dry cleaners one afternoon, and it was autumn, and I saw this beautiful vine that was growing along the side of the highway barrier, and it had lost its leaves, and it reminded me so much of a tree, the classic tree in autumn that has a few leaves left on it and everything's down below at its feet. And it was just a vine, but it was representative of that. And so I had to stop, pull over, get the camera out, get the picture, and then drive on. And it only takes a minute to do that. If you're not on the freeway and you can actually pull over, then it's really an excellent way to break up the monotony of some of the routines of your day. Now, street photography is its own genre, and I get that. So I'm not talking here about photojournalism per se and documentary street photography, but rather just looking at the things that are on the streets, wherever you live, walking around and paying attention to what might be going on, and take a route that you haven't taken before if you go on a morning walk and see if you can find something new. Or take the same path 3 days later and see if you see things new that you didn't notice 3 days before. I want to share this image with you. This is a past tour participant. He came to Morocco with us and also Yosemite, two very different places. But Andre, who is a resident Londoner, he has spent years photographing the streets of London and other places he's visited. And this is a piece of the Guggenheim Museum. And it's the exterior of the museum, but it's how Andre saw it that mattered most to me. And I just love it because it speaks about that creative muse that is with us, even though we sometimes feel like it's disappeared and left us for good. It's there if we just show up and put ourselves through the paces of photographing. At first, it might not be exciting. You might not be seeing anything, and don't let that frustrate you. Just keep doing it. And so over these years, I have followed his work. He has a huge Flickr account. He's got other things. So his name is Andre Boger, and look him up because he's got some really fun photography. And I just felt it was so appropriate to what I'm talking about here. Now, I don't know how far out of London or any city from where you're watching this you'd have to go to find them, but salvage yards, places that have a lot of rusting cars and trucks and metal, scrap yards are a great place to do abstracts and just play around with making something from what other people call junk. And being in the moment. There is a practice that's often called mixong, and mixong loosely translates as good eye, but not in the sense of having a good eye for a photograph, but a good eye or an open mind and heart that appreciates everything that it is seeing. It's a method of walking around and looking and seeing and responding to what you see with a photograph that you'll make. And you need to be very present and in the moment. You can't be chatting about, what the baseball scores were or what the stock exchange is doing or what our current political situation is here in the States, just the mess that it is. You've got to get outside of all of that. You got to throw the baggage away and just walk with an open mind. It's not about analyzing whether it would make a good picture or not. It's really just responding to your first reaction. So I came in the door of a hotel room that I was in and I went, oh, my maid had tidied up for me. And I thought that was very artfully done. It could be a feeling that you're reacting to, not just that analytical, oh, that makes a nice picture, but rather oh, that's nice. And then work from that. So this is a rather long quote. I'll give you time to read it. I firmly believe this. And Ruth Bernhard always said, of course it's magic, but isn't life magic? And I loved that enthusiasm she had for everything. And it was just whatever you turn your camera on can become interesting. So this messes with our heads about what's up and what's down. The yellow is the edge of the stairs, and some people might get that right away because of OSHA and safety standards within the US, but it's so abstract that it still messes with your head. And I love how Jed saw that. I didn't see that, and we were walking down the same steps. And this may just be a rusted lock and a weathered door, but there's a story here with the many layers of paint on these doors. It has good patina, kind of like our own lives, really, with the many layers that we have on us. So it has a good story and it's colorful. The orange and the blue makes it interesting. And then sometimes you find pictures that are very metaphoric and you don't realize it at the time, but sometimes you do. Um, Two friends and I were stuck in March in Botswana. And when the lockdown began to shut everything down, we were desperately trying to get out of town and get back home to the USA. And we were not having any luck. Everything was closing down, the airports were locking down. And two of us were resigned to the fact that, well, we might have to stay in Botswana for a month. And would that be so bad? We had been given a house for free because the woman whose house it was couldn't get back from South Africa. So she said, yes, come and stay in my house, please. So we were okay with that, but one of us was not as okay, and it was understandable, but it was creating, the whole environment was stressful for us. And I finally just said, we need to shake this off. Let's go for a walk tomorrow morning with our cameras. And the town we were in was not terribly attractive, but I believe you can find pictures anywhere. So we walked off and we wandered off and we kind of went off our different ways, 50 to 60 feet apart from each other, looking at things. And when I saw this picture, it grabbed my attention for a number of reasons. First off, the fact that the plant had sprouted and grown up in a dark cavern of this shed and found its way to the light and had wound its way up. And this is about the holes where the chains are about 3 feet off the ground. So it had managed to grow and find the light and then burst out into the light. The contrast of the red and the green was really special. And then later I realized that the locks were kind of like what we were feeling. We were tied down, we were running into obstacles to get out of town. And yet the green and the growth represented the positive attitude and the hope that we were going to make it. And obviously we did, because I'm speaking from my home currently in Santa Rosa, California. So composition is considered when I do this kind of photography always. Even if I'm reacting and quickly making a photograph, it's a gut instinct to compose well. So I saw this image, and before I tripped the shutter, I had to decide whether I wanted to include the actual trunk of the tree or not. And I ultimately chose to include it. So this was the picture that I made. And then afterwards, I thought I should make the other one. So I had an example for teaching to talk about the considerations that you make. And I just felt that having a little bit of the reality of that tree trunk in there gave it connection and balance. But that's a personal choice that one has to make in the field. So even if you're reacting quickly to the things that you see out there, it's still important to consider good composition at all times. So it's always in the back of my mind, even when I'm in that moment and present and trying to be open to what I see around me. So I know that people might be coming up a bit short on ideas being homebound. And so I thought that some of these pictures that I just shared would start getting those juices going. And here's a couple of ideas for you in terms of assignments. And I'll move through these quickly. These assignments are designed to sharpen our eyes and our wits, our senses, and they will also keep your skills honed and your techniques clean so that when you get out in the field to do the kind of photography you want, you don't feel like you're a bucket of rust, right? So it is visual design, the elements of line, texture, pattern, and so forth. These are just examples of that. Give yourself that challenge. Go out and look for those patterns and lines and shapes. and spend a couple of days, spend a week, spend as long as you feel excited about it, or just repeat these assignments as you go forward in looking for things that represent strong design elements. You'll find lines creating a lot of fun shapes. And you could take it one step further and say, I'm going to look for circles, or I'm going to look for squares. So here's a series where I found circles a lot. Once I started consciously thinking about them, they presented themselves to me. It's not like I went out and said, I know where I'll find circles and went for it. I just simply stayed open to the shapes that were presented. And circles over time were a thing that really popped up a lot for me. And then shapes that repeat become patterns, of course. So you start seeing a pattern in all of these pictures that are evolving from the design idea. And again, this is the fold up chairs, or I forget exactly what it is that he shot, but it was on the beach in Cinque Terre, and it was folded up because it wasn't the weather for the beach umbrellas and the chairs to be out. And so he found something interesting in that. And the shapes of the geranium clusters, the shapes of the corn, and the hanging bunches of corn are all repeating shapes that create a pattern in that as well. And then textures. Go out and look for textures in rough sand, rough stone, peeling paint, rusting metal, sand, I don't know, sand on the beach. If you live near a beach, there's lots of textures to be had out there. And this picture is really kind of a nothing picture, although my sister loves it because it was her cat who has since left us. But I saw Charlotte through the screen door, and she was not an outdoor cat, but she would be fascinated to sit there and look at the outdoor world from the safety of her porch. And I liked the screen effect over her. I liked what it did. And when I make pictures like this, they become sort of a reference library in the little gray cells, as Perot says, in the back of my head somewhere. And they come up later, so that when I was in Bhutan and we were at a nunnery, this nun walked through a screen door, and as she started to pass, I went, and I asked her if she would stand there for just a moment so that I could capture this picture of her with lovely light on her face through the screen. So you pull those things up. Once they get into your head as a reference, you begin to see them again. So how about an assignment for light and shadow? Study the light and the effect it has on everything. Now I'm doing black and white here because when I think of light and shadow a lot, I think that high contrast works really well in black and white. But it's not just black and white. And you'll see a few color images at the end of this series. I love this little kitten who looks like a much bigger cat, but just exploring its newfound world. So in color, contrast is often not our friend, but if you pay attention and you use it well, you can still find that in color, you can use light and shadow very effectively. It's just a matter of studying it and figuring out what might work. Another assignment might be looking for an existing single color. So I chose red for this example. And it's just pictures where red is the dominant color in them. And it's a whole variety of images, again, to hopefully stimulate you, because each person will resonate, hopefully, to more than just one of these pictures, but you'll resonate to certain ones because they're familiar to you, or, oh, that's a neat idea. I didn't think about that. So it's a real mix. I mean, here we are at a restaurant in somewhere, Botswana or Namibia, I can't remember. And it was just the red napkin and the fork, and the pattern of the placemat made it a fun, interesting, casual picture. And then this only has a little spot of red in it, and yellow is now screaming at us. It's dominating here. So you might think, oh, well, I've done single colors. Maybe I should be looking for color harmony and color contrast. And so then when you start thinking about that, you go out and you look for how colors relate to each other. And that helps you think about composition in terms of how much proportion you're going to give to each of those colors, and what it is that you want to say about it. And you know, the blue and the orange here just screamed at me as I was walking past this scene. And it's just a life preserver on a wall, but that's all it needs to be. The warm and cool color contrast can be very interesting. Again, a market where I think the vendor put it there so that we would notice the red tomatoes, because that yellow one grabs our attention, and then we see the rest of them and say, oh, I think I'll buy a few of those tomatoes. And then primary colors were in this picture, and I thought you could take that a step further, where now it's not just one or two colors, but how can you work with the colors that you have and figuring out what's going to dominate and what the balance of all that is. And reflections are another great mini assignment to give yourself. And this picture may be a tad cliche, but they can still be fun when you take pictures of reflections in a marina or harbor and invert them. And every once in a while, you get one that's more watercolor-like, pun intended, but it has more of a painterly feel, and so it's fun. But I like to push past that cliche and look for things that can appear as reflection, and to look for layers that give a reflection some depth sometimes. So they can be very graphic. In this case, the repeating patterns of the dock grabbed my attention along with the colors. And this was so rippled, and I thought, oh, I'm going to turn this one upside down because this really has a wonderful stippled look, right? And then along comes this mallard duck cruising into the picture, and that changed the plan, because when I turned it upside down, the duck looked really odd. Even though it was reflected, it just made it not work. So that made the decision for me. And this is Jed seeing in the way only Jed can see. Each one of us has our own vision. And the water surface was so calm, and yet there was an oily slick on it, and it was a cloudy day, and that oil slick actually added texture to the water. So it almost doesn't look like water, but it looks like textured paper, and yet it really is water. And we get that because of the boat and the anchor. And Jed does a lot of private tutoring, and he often uses San Francisco, which is pretty close to our backyard, as his playground and his workshop field area. And he comes away with some really fun pictures from that as well. He had a few raised eyebrows on this one, though, because he was in a men's restroom and he saw this, and he just saw how everything lined up. And other men were a little bit confused about why he was going into the men's room with a camera around his shoulder. But he persisted nonetheless, because that's just who Jed is. So I'm convinced that wherever you live, you have amazing reflections that you can photograph. And this final category can be such fun. Webster defines juxtaposition as the fact of two things being seen or placed close together with contrasting effect. So here is a great example. What the heck is that leaf or that plant doing right in the crack? Now, we logically know, if we analyze, that it found a space and it crept through it and life persists. But it's so incongruous to the rest of the scene, and that juxtaposition makes that interesting. You might not understand why the hanger's here. Hopefully you get that it's holding up the window. These are historic windows in a very historic hotel, and they are decrepit windows and they will not stay up anymore. And they can't change the windows out, and they haven't found somebody who can repair this type of window. So somebody wanted fresh air, so they used their coat hanger to keep the window open. And again, there's that screen effect, okay? That's in the back of my mind, and it caught my eye not only because of the hanger, but because that screen added such wonderful texture to the whole thing. And this hotel is like $500 a night to stay there, and you have to hold up your window with a hanger. No air conditioning in the room, I guess. So this juxtaposition was humorous. It was a painter who obviously doesn't use the paper towel that he put into his back pocket. So is this a very small guy or a very large horse that would tie up here? Scale can be a really fun thing to play with. The classic beauty and brains opposing each other. And then delicate and hard, nature and industrial. Same thing out in nature, the softness of a feather and the hardness of the rocks on the beach. Those all help me to see that juxtaposition everywhere. And I think that's really important because when I go out into nature, I will often find that juxtaposition. When I rounded the corner and I saw this doorway, for a split second, I thought it was hands or fingers that were pulling back a curtain. And then I realized it was a fishing net hanging up as a privacy curtain. And I thought, how cool is that? And it was a fun trick on the eyes and the brain. And I'm hoping that 90% of you that saw this at first glance thought the same thing. But it's that surprise element that makes it worthy of being a photograph. And there was just something funny about this, that the person left their glove and walked away. And there it sits. And with juxtaposition comes humor. And it's the silliness, okay? If we allow ourselves to be silly, then we start seeing some silly things. And this is the classic letterbox and apartment door, bells and whatnot. And there was the face. And it's just silly, but it's fun. And that's why I photographed it. And the same thing here. This boat had a face on it. I don't go out looking for it. It's just presented itself to me. And clearly the maintenance workers were not seeing the big picture when they put this manhole cover back on. Or maybe they didn't care, but Jed took advantage of that opportunity because it was just so funny that they never bothered to line it up. Either that or when they were painting the street, they really took a radical turn to be creative with their stripes. And here, petroleum must be history now because we're back to using bicycles, right? And it's a museum on the petroleum industry. As if one could get up to 5 miles per hour on these stairs? Not likely. And I pulled up to get a takeout coffee and I looked off to my left and I saw this very unique way of watering the trees. And it isn't really, but it just lined up that way. So I had to make a picture of that because I just thought it was rather funny. And there's something wrong with this cat. I've never known a cat to pass up fish. And yet it just sat there and didn't bother. So maybe the fish had gone off even for the cat to eat it. And one day in the park with Jed and our dog, who had a dog friend. This is Zora. And it's equally funny because the dog's name is Zora. But it was like the old Western shootout, the standoff at the OK Corral or something. And so just getting a different viewpoint can sometimes be fun. Oh, I forgot I had one last section of abstracts. I'll go through it very quickly. Abstracts where you've now photographed things that you no longer know what they are. You don't care what they are. They're just about light and shadow and pattern and things that make your eye think and wonder. and they can be found anywhere, but they're not easy to make. You've got to isolate to a point where you feel like you've taken it way outside of its elements. All right, so our final recap is where you might find pictures: in the backyard, local streets, markets, harbors, industrial lots, lakes, parks. And what are you looking for? Anything: visual design elements, colors and contrast, light and shadow, juxtaposition and humor, abstracts, shapes, you name it. And then, if you've always used a wide angle, consider using a telephoto for a week and photograph everything through that telephoto lens. And even better, make it harder on yourself and choose a focal length on that telephoto and tape the lens so you can't change it. Force yourself to see the world at 200 millimeters, or force yourself to see the world in wide angle if you always shoot telephoto. And if you always photograph in color, commit to looking for and understanding what pictures would make good black and whites before you press the shutter, not just converting later. Or vice versa. If you're always doing monochrome, think about color and how color relates in a picture. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing and turn it over to questions and answers. And I thank you all for being here. I hope you stick around for the Q&A. And are we back?
Thanks so much.
There
That was fabulous, Brenda. You've certainly given me a lot to think about, and I've written lots of notes. So I'm going to go out there and really look at my home in a different way now. So that's really great. So yes, everybody, if you haven't already done so, if you'd like to go to the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screen, or at the top of your screen if you're on a tablet, and pose any questions there, then I can pick those up and put them to Brenda for you. I think we have
while we're giving everyone a minute. Yeah, before you get into those, while we're giving everyone a minute to maybe come up with some, because I know a program like this is rather esoteric and kind of out there with creative ideas. So it's not like Lightroom and somebody's going to have a dozen questions about how you do something in Lightroom. But one of the questions that I often get asked is what equipment I use. And so, of course, the camera is a black box. And it doesn't really matter what brand it is. I do use Sony gear and I love it. It's mirrorless. I've been mirrorless now for about 5 years and very happy with it. And when I go out to, especially go out to work a lot of the street photography or this general photography that I'm sharing, I try to keep my kit simple because if you're schlepping around a big, heavy backpack or shoulder bag and all the gear and the flash and the tripod and everything, you often tire yourself out and you don't see as freely and creatively. So for some of this, I really go casual. But if I want to be serious about some of the work that I'm photographing to make it effective, then I will apply my craft to it and bring a tripod, of lightweight one, but I'll bring one along. And if I see something that I really need to know it's going to come out perfect, then I'll take the time to set that all up.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. That answered the first question. Lynn Gregory has actually looked up the name of that book you were talking about, and it's called The Zen of Seeing by Frederick Frank. So thank
you. Because yes, there's another book called 10,000 Things, and it's a collection of just the 10,000 things in our lives that we'll see, and I got them mixed up. So yeah.
Okay, I definitely have to look him up. We've got a question here from Peter Bozeman. He says, can you talk a little more about the technique of photographing the floating flowers under the water droplets?
Oh, certainly. It's really quite simple, although I don't know what the product would be called in other parts of the world, but I've taken a piece of glass or good unscratched plexiglass, And when I spray it and I wipe it down with a product called Rain-X. It's designed to, like for your windshield so that water beads up and it doesn't run and smear. And that allows you to take a very fine, like a hairspray bottle kind of, but an atomizer, plant sprayer would be a good one. And you just spray the top surface of that piece of glass ever so little, and you build up slowly, but you get beads of water, and the surface tension allows them to stay as beads because of that product that you've coated the glass or plastic with. And then I've actually propped that between two sawhorses so that it's just suspended over a bowl of flowers or a bouquet. I've done several things like that where it might be just the bouquet is sitting below it. And I have to adjust where that height is depending on what I want for depth of field, because you do have an option of photographing the beads of water and getting those sharp and letting everything behind it become out of focus washes of color. And if you choose the right depth of field, you can define some of that to be floral, or you could shoot almost wide open and let the water drops be sharp, but let everything else become just color. So you have variations there in terms of your f-stop. And then you also can vary that, given your f-stop now gets the beads of water sharp, you can move your bowl up or down in height away from the glass to get it sharper or less sharp. And we've seen a lot of pictures, like in the US, the American flag, sharply focused in each of the water drops that's on a piece of glass. And that's done that same way, where someone's put an American flag underneath that glass that is just like a tabletop. So that's sort of in a nutshell how you do it.
Oh, that's
Did
really
that answer the
interesting.
question?
I hope that's answered the question. It sounds really interesting. Thank you. Now I've got a question here from Simon Joseph. He says, does Brenda have any special way of annotating or cataloguing her images, which allows to pull up any particular image without having to scroll through thousands of them?
Oh yeah. You could have me back for a webinar on organizing in Lightroom. I use Lightroom. And when I import, when I import my images, I put a few basic keywords on them. So if it's something I've shot with my iPhone, it always gets the keyword iPhone. So I could at one hit call up every iPhone picture I've ever made. If it's got any sort of teaching value for me, like visual design, I might put the keyword lines or shapes or texture in there. I will put the location of where I photographed it. So the keywords are essential. And I do those basic ones on import. And I don't put the year in because I rename my files so that they start with my last name, and then I put a date code. So it would be 2020 10/17 for today, and then a hyphen and the last 4 digits of the unique file code of that image. So the date is always searchable by the file name very easily. And but it's really just some basic keywords. And I've been to Death Valley 12 times. So if I may have 12 different Death Valley folders in my Lightroom hierarchy. And I don't want to have to look at each one of those and say, oh my gosh, what year did I photograph that plant coming up through the mud crack? But I can type in the keyword of Death Valley and I'll get everything from all 12 trips. Now that's a bit of scrolling. So if I've done my homework on import, I might also have Death Valley or mud cracks. Ooh, that might get me a lot closer and a smaller subset. So I think it's really essential. And if you're not using Lightroom, hopefully you'll use some other organizing program that allows you to do some keywording, like in Bridge even. You can bulk add keywords to things. Yeah.
That's great
essential.
advice. Yeah, thank you. Okay, we
You're
have
welcome.
a question here from Wendy. I hope I get this right. Wendy Akers or Akers. I love your background image, which you showed us briefly. Could you tell us what it is and how you shot it?
It
Please.
is a piece of corrugated steel or galvanized, I think is what it was. And it's just that, except that it had gotten crumpled somehow. And they were using it to sort of cordon off a vacant lot. And it was just a jaggedy piece that was stuck up on the cyclone fence. But because it was crumpled, there was dimension to it. And the blue is actually catching the light of open shade. And the lighter, sort of warmer areas is bounce light from the dirt path that I was on. It was a dirt side road, and that light was kicking all the warm light up onto the metal. But the areas that were angled differently didn't catch that bounce light, but instead caught the light of blue sky. And so, that's how that picture came to be, very abstract.
Great, thank you. I've got a question here from Roger Norton. He said, do you ever create an image by, for example, placing a leaf on a drain grating?
Do I have to answer that honestly?
Yes.
Yes, I do. Sometimes I do. I'm in love with the found object, with the discovery of something already there for me, because I feel like that is such a gift from the universe, to be really California about it. But I love designing. And so sometimes I'll see something and it needs something else. And so if there's a leaf nearby, that leaf could have just as easily fallen on the grate, and the wind just blew it off to the right or to the left. So I might take it and I might place it. But what I find, if you're placing one object, you can usually get away with it and it looks very natural. But try as I will, when I've tried to put other leaves or elements on that same grate, it looks fake. And it's very, very difficult to do it in the chaotic way that nature would do it. And I find that automatically we end up spacing things too evenly apart and they look placed. So if I want like a couple of leaves on that grate, I'll pick up a handful of leaves and I'll toss them in the air and I'll let it land and I'll see what happens. And maybe I'll get something out of that. But an individual element placed, I sometimes will, and that's pretty easy to have it look right. There
Okay.
you have my secrets.
That's great, thank you. I've got a question here from David McKibben. He's really enjoyed your interesting presentation. Do you use your images for any specific purposes, i.e. a photo book, wall art, or something like that?
I do. A lot of my landscape, nature, wildlife photography is sold as fine art prints and also included in shows and publications. I license my images for commercial use as well. And that includes the many of the images that are in this presentation. They've been worthy of the wall, either here or someone else has purchased them. So I have two websites. I have my own website, brendatharp.com, that has some limited edition print galleries on it. And then I direct people for wall art, office decor, so forth. I direct them over to a Smug Mug gallery that I have that has a whole list of categories and is searchable by just about any subject matter. And so those are available for licensing or purchasing over there. And eventually my own website will probably have that collection back, but I haven't had time to build all that up. So yeah, they get used for that and for books. I mean, every book that I do is pulling some from the archives and also some new work that I've created along the way. So, and I use them for teaching and nonprofits and so forth. Yeah.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. I've got a question from Peter Knight. He says, do you Photoshop or edit your images in any way?
Yes, you have to if you're shooting in RAW, because RAW files are flat. They lack the contrast and the punch. And what you have to remember is if you're doing art as photography and not photojournalism, and even photojournalism needs editing in terms of building the contrast back or the, saturation and whatnot to make it look like you saw it. But when you're making art, you can go any direction you want. And so I am bringing the images usually to the level of what I remembered seeing. So if it was the blue in the background here that caught my eye, I'm going to make sure that that really comes out in that final picture. And the flat file, the raw file, just didn't look like anything. But the minute I started playing with my contrast and my vibrance and adding some curves and getting the whites and so forth, then all of a sudden it pops. So I think everything needs some editing. I do remove some things. Sometimes I will have a stem that I didn't see and I will remove that from a corner or from an edge. But I don't do that if it's documentary, if it's photojournalism, where it would be affecting the truth of the picture.
Okay, thank you. I've got a question from Alec Davies. He says, do you have your camera settings ready before you take images? As by the look of it, you don't have a lot of time to take them. If so, what are your all-purpose settings, as it were?
Very good question. Very good question. I I do when I head out the door. I usually have the classic saying is F8 and be there. So and that's because it as street photographers and as documentary photographers wanted to be more ready, they found that if they chose f8 around 35 millimeter focal length, they had a really good depth of field to work with. They would set up their hyperfocal setting for depth of field on their lens, and like Cartier-Bresson could literally pick up the camera, click, and look the other way, and nobody knew he had made the picture. He had an art for that, and many people do. And that was the secret of that type of photography, was to be ready with some presets. So in some ways, if I'm doing that kind of photography, I will do that as well. I will look at the light. I'm using auto ISO typically. I'll set my aperture to be around f8 or f11 because I tend to like to work in the 50 to 100 millimeter range a lot. So I use f11, and then my shutter speed will typically be something that would freeze the moment within that focal length. So that will vary a little bit, but it's not just a point and shoot that I'm doing. I'm trying to get some setup, and if I need to make a quick adjustment, I will in the moment. And as you can see, a lot of these aren't people related. They're not the gestures. I didn't include those because they complicate things. But most of these, I could take a moment or two to get the shot right without having to, worry about losing it.
Okay, thank you. I have a question from Ian McIntosh. He says, what reactions do you get from non-photographers when you are photographing odd subjects?
Oh, lots of different ones. We had a situation where we were in Yellowstone. We were teaching a workshop, Jed and I, and it was winter. And we came to a screeching halt because the bare trees had just been blackened, and it was a snowy field, and the shadows of the trees were just lovely all over the snow. And in Yellowstone, if you've got a car on the side of the road, 90% of the time you think wildlife, wildlife, where is it? And all the cars will come to a screeching stop and look for the animal. And so this guy stops his RV, and it was actually not quite winter, but we had had a snowfall because he was still there with his RV, and you don't typically drive those through Yellowstone in winter. But he stopped and he got out of the car and he ran over and he said, "What do you see? What do you see?" And Jed looked up and he said, "Oh, it's just the shadows of the trees on the snow here." And the guy gave him the strangest look, ran back to his car. And as he was getting in, he said, "They're just photographing trees or something." And he took off. And we had such a good laugh at that because we saw beauty in it. So when we take the time to show somebody, often we'll get a surprise like, "Wow, that is really cool. I never noticed that before." And it's our hope that that will open up more people to seeing the beauty that's right around them. So we
Yeah.
love to share, but we do get a few odd looks and
Yeah,
comments.
I bet. Thank
You
you.
have to let those roll off your back. You just can't let it stop you. You can't be self-conscious when you're doing this.
Thanks for that. We've got actually Steve Smith. He's come up and he's found out for information. Everybody, Rain X is available from Amazon UK in a spray bottle for $7.99. So if people want to write that down, okay.
Thank you, Amazon, right?
Yeah. Okay, I've got a question from Sharon Powell, and she says, is it best to use natural light for the flower bowl photo, or what lighting would be recommended?
I would suggest natural light, but with that, I would also consider that you might need to use one of the disc reflectors, like the diffusers that unfold in that strange, fun way. Those are perfect for controlling the light. You might have to control reflections that are outside of your scene or stray light that you don't want. Flash creates a problem because you've got way too many pinpoints of light reflecting back off the bubbles of the water drops rather, and all of the glass and reflective surfaces. So it's really best to use available light for those.
Right, thank you. I've got a question from Maria Isabella Bonaccini. I think this lady might be from Italy, I could be wrong.
Yeah.
She says, do you recommend any macro lenses? And she said, thanks for the presentation, it's really good.
Oh, well, I'm glad she enjoyed it. And yes, a consideration you have to think about is that there's macro lenses that are in the 50 to 65 millimeter range, and they get you so close that you are now breathing the same air that the insect is, because it's great magnification, but you're almost blocking your own light. You're in so close. 100 millimeters, which has become somewhat of the standard in the industry, gives you some working distance. And as a non-macro lens, it's also a beautiful portrait lens, but it's a good all-purpose lens. And a dedicated macro, 100 or 105 millimeters, will give you life size 1:1. And some distance. So you have a chance to capture some things before they fly away. But if you really want to focus on some macro with butterflies, dragonflies, insects, and so forth, your best bet is to really look at a 180 or a 200 millimeter macro. They're a little bit heftier, but they narrow the field of view, which is lovely because you always have to worry about your backgrounds in macro. But the thing is, they offer you that working distance. So instead of being this far away, you can now be this far away. You can't see my hands anymore, but it allows you the chance to get a 1:1 macro of a butterfly on a flower without the thing flying away. So yeah, that's the only real consideration of that. I would say as a general all-purpose lens, the 100 or 105 is great, but consider what it is that you might want to use it for.
Okay, great, thank you. Also, Colin Harrison has come back. He says Rain-X is also available at Halfords in the UK.
Good, I'll go there tomorrow.
Yeah, great, be nice to see you.
I wish.
Okay, I've got a good question from Eleanor Brichetti.
Hi, Eleanor.
How do you get iPhone pictures into Lightroom?
Well, I plug in my phone, and in Lightroom, when you do an import, and boy, it's been so long, I don't know if there was anything special that I ever did. I believe that just on import, it recognizes that your phone is plugged into your computer. And I think that's all there is to it. But Eleanor, you live pretty much in my backyard, maybe 60 miles away. So I will talk to you about that if I find out that there's something different. But I believe it's just that once the phone's plugged in, you click import in Lightroom and you choose the source to be your phone, and then it will bring those in.
Okay, thank you. And then John Leeson is asking, do you select between JPEG and RAW when using a camera?
I photograph raw all the time, but on occasion, I will also use raw plus JPEG, the finest JPEG setting that I can get. Now, yes, that uses more memory, but where that's been effective for me is when I'm teaching and I want to be able to quickly show in the moment. I might be out photographing with my students and I have an example that I'd like to share. So the JPEG just means that I don't have to spend that time processing it, and it will be good enough for the example. And sometimes I want to remember what the color of the light was and remember a little bit more of the reality of the scene. And so by having the JPEG, which in my camera, I've set my JPEG settings to be realistic, not super vivid or any of those other things. So that JPEG is a pretty good representation of the scene as it was. And that enables me to bring the raw file back to that if I was in a tricky lighting situation that I felt I needed it for. So not all the time, but that's when JPEG can be useful for me.
Okay, understand. Thank you. Right, I've got a question from Mick Warmington. This is interesting. What, in your opinion, is a fine art print?
Do we have 2 hours? It's a very good question. Fine art is one of those things that's really difficult to decide or define, because I think that galleries have started to create that definition. If it's worthy enough to be hung on the wall, or it's desired and sought after by collectors, it's fine art. But that could be any subject matter, because art is subjective, just like paintings. So photography, I think, if it's extremely well crafted, if it creates an impact, whether you like the subject matter or not, if it has impact, if it's well crafted, both in camera and also well crafted as a print, I think that any subject matter can be worthy of being considered fine art. And that is my opinion, for what it's worth. And there will be 6 other opinions that would come out of, or more, out of just the audience here today.
I'm sure. Thank you. I've got a question here from Lois Wakeman. She says, do you feel that meeting your public, at least those who appreciate these subjects as I do, validates your vision? Or are you confident enough in yourself not to need this?
I would hope that by now, and we won't talk about how old I am, by now in my career, that I am confident that I don't need it. But I think that would be dishonest, because I think we all have, artists in general, you have an ego, you have a desire to share, for one. And so to some degree, I think there is the hope that I will receive those likes and the accolades from something, but not from a standpoint of it proving that I'm worthy, but rather that I did my job well, that the feeling I had when I made the picture somehow translated and transcended into the final image, where others are going, wow, it's causing them to think, it's causing them to respond. And if I've been able to do that, and I get that kind of feedback, then that puts a smile on my face and it lifts me up, because I know that my work has made a difference.
Excellent, thank you. I've got a question from Graham Nibbs. Do you use full manual or aperture priority, etc.?
I used to use aperture priority all the time. That was my go-to, and a fixed ISO, and I would choose the ISO and, and get set up. And in doing landscape photography, I will still do that. But for a lot of my photography, especially when I started photographing travel and wildlife, by time you decided you needed to go from 400 to 1600 ISO, the animal had climbed down the tree, right? And that was very frustrating. And it's very challenging to change all of your settings so quickly. So ISO, auto ISO, is a wonderful gift from the gods. I use auto ISO, and I've set my parameters so that it doesn't go higher than I think is usable in terms of noise. And I use manual. And so I set my shutter and I set my aperture the way I want. I use my compensation dial to compensate the picture exposure. But now I've taken the ISO out of the equation, and it goes up and down as it needs to. So for in those moments where I know when I get into that safari vehicle that I want to be up at a 1600th of a second at f8 at least, that's my starting point, let's say, I know that the ISO is going to follow along, and I can go up and down in my shutter speed as needed, or aperture, but it's one less thing that I have to think about. So in the shade, in the sun, it rapidly changes, and it's been excellent. Now, when I'm on a tripod and I'm doing macro or landscape photography of some sort, I'll take it off auto ISO because I want full control. And I will go down to the lowest ISO and use my settings and slow my shutter down to be able to use that 100 ISO, let's say.
Great, thank you. I've got a question from Liz Cooper. You've shown us a great array of genre, but if you had to choose one, which would be your favourite?
My passion, what started me down this path of photography so many years ago, was nature. My family was really outdoor oriented. We would backpack and canoe and family camp. And so being out in nature first and falling in love with nature and the beauty of that natural world was there. And then my dad was the family photographer, and he also liked to photograph the big scene, but he didn't really push himself creatively. Nonetheless, I imitated him. He gave me his hand-me-down cameras, and I went from there. And so nature was really what I got started on. I cut my teeth on that. It still remains my most favorite area. And nature is a big umbrella. I understand that. But it is wildlife, the intimate landscape. Probably the intimate landscape is by far my most favorite way to photograph general nature, not including wildlife. But the grand landscape is wonderful and beautiful, but boy, you have to have just the right light, and everything has to be just so for that. The intimate landscape that doesn't include the sky, and it often is in open shade or diffused light, means that you have so many more things that you can photograph. So, and somehow I see that way. It just gravitate towards that small picture within the big picture.
Thank you. I've got a Jenny Fenton would like to know, I think we've mentioned this previously, please could you remind me of the book you mentioned again? I think it was 1000 something.
Oh, and we answered that. Yeah. 10,000 Things is the name of one of the books. And then the art of, what was the other one? Frederick Frank's book, The Art of Seeing.
Yes. I think it was the
Is that terrible?
10,000
My brain's
ones.
just,
Yeah. I think if you Googled that, we'd be able to find it. We might even be able to
and
put
if
it
they
up.
go back through the chat, they
Yes.
could find where somebody typed that in.
Yes. Yeah. And we'll have the recording as well. So you'll be able to
Yeah.
see it on that. Okay, lovely.
Great.
Thank you. Just got a couple more questions to go now.
Sure.
I've got a question from Jonathan Langsner. He says, you lead travel photography trips. When doing travel photography, not on assignment, do you follow photojournalistic ethics, or do you feel free to stage portraits or otherwise rearrange elements?
It's a little bit of both. I love the discovered scene in all things. So when I'm doing travel photography, that documentary approach, being the fly on the wall, capturing life being lived without me interfering, is often really special. You get some wonderful images from that because you're not noticed. You haven't affected the moment. On the other hand, I love to celebrate the faces of the places that I visit. And so I will often ask for an opportunity to make a portrait of them. And in that instance, I may ask them to move into the shade or to move against this wall, which might be a cleaner background. I try to feel out every situation to see whether they're amenable to that. And then that portrait becomes a relationship between me and that person and that connection that I have, even if I don't speak the language. I'm pretty good at making a fool out of myself by miming and, the whole charade thing. And it gets them laughing and it puts them at ease. And I somehow also hope that I let them know that I'm genuinely interested in who they are, their face, their clothing they're wearing, all of that, so that I bring to it a feeling of comfortness and of respect. Comfortness, that's not a word, but and respect that they can feel, and that gives
Mhm.
me a better picture too. So it is
Great.
really a mix.
Yeah, thank you very much.
By the way, the book Frederick Frank is The Zen of Seeing. It just
Okay, the Zen of
Deborah
Seeing.
just texted me. It was like, thank you, Deborah.
Right. Okay. I've got a question from Richard Chave Cox. Following on from you using JPEG to give a representation of the light, etc., when you're shooting, which white balance do you choose, please?
Oh, yeah. Okay. I am using auto white balance. Even for my raw, it used to be that I did daylight because I came from slide photography and what you saw was what you got unless you put filters on it. So when I switched into digital, I would change my white balance because, oh, today's a cloudy day. That's going to be very cold blue light. I'll change to cloudy, or I'll change to shade, depending on how thick the clouds were, and so forth. And when I initially did that digitally, it was fine. And that way the LCD showed me more of what the reality would be like under the filtered light. But then when shooting JPEGs, that worked. But if I didn't change it back, the JPEG might be off. So if I think I'm going to be using JPEG as well, I'll switch into auto white balance if I'm not there already, so that the JPEG is already color corrected, so that I have that representation being more accurate. And in the raw file, of course, it doesn't matter. It's just more pleasing if you've got a corrected image that you're looking at on the LCD, because that's more to what you're seeing with your eyes anyway, because we auto white balance with our eyes.
Okay, that's great. This is the last question now, and it's from Richard Milton Worsell. And he says, again, it's in relation to another question that's been asked previously. What are your auto ISO maximum limits?
Oh, good question. It depends on the camera and how well it handles noise. So, and also how critical it is to get the shot. So I've been testing them out, but I have an A9, a Sony A9 that I was using in Botswana. And I actually made some pictures at 10,000 ISO because I had to. It was an incredible moment with elephants, and I wanted that. Now, that picture may not go on to be a fine art print at 40 by 60 on the wall because of the noise issues, but it was still a fact of recording that moment in life for me. And also running it through Topaz, which I use a lot, Topaz denoise. It did an incredible job of managing the noise and reducing the noise on a lot of my pictures. That being said, I typically will run my maximum ISO up to 8,000 and not let it go higher without consciously saying, okay, I'm going to go out of auto ISO and I'm going to push it higher. And on other cameras, my Mark III, I've tended to make that maximum 6,400, and my I have the A7R3 and the A7 III. And on the A7 III and the R3, both, I think it's set at either 3,200 or 6,400. You know, we all got caught up in wanting the finest grain on film, and those that didn't do film that got into digital and had to deal with noise, we still want the finest noise that we can manage. But at the expense of missing the moment, what's the point? So photojournalists never worried about that. If it was a grainy shot, it was the moment that transcended that grain. So to some degree, going higher on your ISO is worth it if you're doing that kind of photography where it's the moment that you need, more importantly than the finest grain of sand in a still life.
Brilliant. Thanks so much. Brenda, once again, that was the last question. Many thanks for that brilliant presentation and also for answering all of those questions. Thank you so much.
Oh, I just wanted to say it was a pleasure. I'm so happy to see the questions. It was really excellent. I just wanted to take a moment to say thank you, Avril, for managing this and you know, for fielding the questions, and for Neil and Deborah, who were behind the scenes, but Deborah invited me to do this presentation, and I'm so grateful I've had that opportunity, and just all of the things that go on behind the scenes to make these presentations go off as smoothly as they do. I'm grateful to everyone involved, and thank you all to everyone that hung in there to the end and watched this presentation. I hope that you truly enjoyed it.
We've had nearly 400 people, so it's been great. And some people will watch again on the recording, because obviously we have people all over the world and some can't, you know, it's not a good time of day where they are. Just for everybody though, for information on Brenda's mentoring program, you can visit her website at www.brendatharp.com. We'll include this link along with our survey and a link to this recording in a day or so. RPS Digital Imaging Group are very glad you joined us for this event. It's been our 10th online presentation and we have many more in the pipeline. If you're not already a member of the Digital Imaging Group, you will find that although the fee for non-members is low, if you join our group as an online member, you'll probably save money. Our next online event is a talk by Nigel Goldsmith on the 7th of November called Smartphone Photography, the Missing Manual. We hope to see you then, same time, same place. In the meantime, stay safe everyone and have a good rest of the weekend.